Around 7,000 years ago, in central Saudi Arabia, a group of people came together to create one of the largest structures that had ever been built in human history, measuring over 600 meters in length. It's called a Mustatil. But even more staggering is that this Mustatil is not alone. Mustatil of a variety of sizes have been found spread across Saudi Arabia, covering an area the size of Poland. To date, over 1,600 of these structures have been identified. And for the last 6 years, my team and I have been excavating them.
Hi, my name's Hugh Thomas. I have a PhD in archaeology, I am a lecturer of archaeology, and for the last 20 plus years I've been conducting fieldwork all across the world. But for today's video, it's probably my role as co-director of the prehistoric Al Ula and Khaybar excavation project that is the most important, because it is this project that is spearheading our research into our understanding of the Mustatil. It might sound odd, but our understanding of Mustatil is really still in its infancy, because although these structures are so big, we haven't really started excavating them until the last few years. If you watched my last video, and if you haven't, link below, go back and do your homework please, you might remember that we did a thing called a remote sensing survey of the regions of Al Ula and Khaybar. This is where we use satellite imagery to identify archaeological structures, and one of those structure types were Mustatil. So what does a Mustatil look like in satellite imagery? Well, it looks like a big rectangle, and that's why they're called Mustatil, because Mustatil is the Arabic word for rectangle. As we began to take aerial photographs and ground survey these structures, we realized very early on that Mustatil are all made of the same components. So what are they? So here is a standard Mustatil, a large rectangle. And you can see the two shorter ends are a lot thicker. That's what we call the base and the head. And they're connected by a series of long walls, which creates what's called a courtyard. Most of the entranceways are particularly small. The one that you can see on your screen is about 30 centimeters in width, which is about the same length as a standard ruler. So for someone my size, it's quite difficult to get through. You have to kind of shimmy sideways. But the other thing is that animals were definitely not getting in there through these entranceways. Outside the base, you might find some other types of structures. These are called associated structures, and there are a few different types. These are what we call cells. These are interlocking sort of circular structures, often with a large orthostat stone sticking out of them. I particularly like this example where someone had removed that orthostat stone and then leant it against the base of the Mustatil. We don't find really any evidence of them cutting or shaping the stone. In fact, a lot of the stone that is present in this region just kind of breaks off from these large rectangular slabs. So what we think is happening is they're just prying them off and using them to build the Mustatil. And when they find a really big one, they turn it into this large, what's called an orthostat stone. Now in some areas, like in areas where there's a heavy amount of basalt, the stone doesn't break up like that. So instead what they do is they create towers of just stacked basalt. This one's over 1.5 meters tall. But most of the associated structures built outside the front of the base are actually located really close to the structure. So again, you would have to kind of squeeze your way between them. Sometimes these associated structures were used to make incredibly complex entranceways. This Mustatil is one of the largest ever found. The entranceway is a series of what can only be described as corridors. Inside these corridors, they place masses of stacked towers of stone up to 1.5 meters tall. You can see they've all toppled over. You would have to weave between these like forests of stacked stone in order to enter this Mustatil. One of the biggest questions we get about the Mustatil is specifically about the courtyard. People don't think that these are ritual structures. They wonder if they are animal pens or they were used to hold water. We often find that many of the long walls are only a single course high, or alternatively, they just have gaps in them. They were not designed to hold anything in. They were more used to kind of just demarcate this space. The other way we know these weren't used to hold water or livestock is that a lot of them are found in really difficult terrain. For example, here you can see several Mustatil built up on a volcano. So 7,000 years ago, you and your family have come to a Mustatil. You've squeezed yourself between some associated structures at the front of the Mustatil, shimmied sideways through the entranceway, walked into the courtyard, and moved several hundred meters up to the head. The reality is the head is where the interesting stuff happens, and it's where we find the evidence that these are ritual structures. Now, although local people in Saudi Arabia likely knew about these structures for millennia, academically, they haven't been known about for a particularly long time. The first academic publication related to a Mustatil was in 1978, when a group of international archaeologists conducted this large-scale survey of northern Saudi Arabia. It mentions how there's a presence of a rectangular enclosure made of two parallel lines of vertical slabs. It also goes on to state that whatever the date, the rectangular enclosure is a unique monument in the area so far covered by the survey. In 2008, a group of citizen archaeologists called the Desert Team published a blog where they were documenting structures they were identifying through Google Maps. One of their team members, Dr. Abdullah Al-Sayed, contacted Professor David Kennedy at the University of Western Australia and alerted him to these specific types of structures. Along with David, Abdullah Al-Sayed published an article in Aramco World, first detailing a lot of these monumental stone structures, including Mustatil. Other notable publications included Sheikh Abdullah bin Muhammad Al Shaya in 2009, who published these really beautiful photographs of a couple of Mustatil. The thing I love the most is the description on the right-hand side that ends with, "How strange," or "Isn't this strange?" But Mustatil really entered the wider public eye in 2017. David Kennedy, who I mentioned before, had now spent several years documenting a number of Mustatil across Saudi Arabia, but only through satellite imagery. And he published this paper on them. Now, he used the term gates for them. It's subsequently been replaced by the term Mustatil. At the time of writing the article, David had identified 389 Mustatil across Saudi Arabia, primarily around the region of the Harik Khaibar to the north of Medina. David was able to work out that these gates, or Mustatil, were quite old because they were often overbuilt by later types of structures, such as pendant tombs, and if you haven't looked at my last video on the pendant tombs of Saudi Arabia, that's your homework after you finish this video. I'll put a link below and check the end of this video. He also identified an instance where there was a kite, this monumental type of animal hunting trap, that had reused the stone of a Mustatil. Now, kites are known to be quite old, so he recognized that Mustatil were very old. The question was, how old were they? I had a chance to visit this site a few years ago whilst the river next to it was flooding, and this is a hint for something later in this video. It was then in 2018 that Wala Bouazizi and Oxford Archaeology were able to conduct the very first archaeological excavation of a Mustatil, and suffice to say, they found something phenomenal. Inside the head of this Mustatil, they found skulls and horns of 67 animals, including 39 goats, 11 cattle, 4 sheep. But they also found gazelle, ibex, and even an auroch. They also found some disturbed human remains, which is something I'm going to discuss later on. If you're interested in learning more about Wales excavation, you can actually watch a documentary about it called The Architects of Ancient Arabia. And I hear it's particularly good. So in 2019, our project began excavation. And one of the earliest structures we identified that we wanted to excavate was this, a large Mustatil to the east of the town of Al Ula. We chose this Mustatil because it was much larger than the one excavated by Weil, but it also had a head that was underneath an overhang, and we thought that that might lead us to the best chance of finding well-preserved remains inside. As we began to clear the head, we realized that there was a well-defined chamber, but interestingly, in the center of it, there was a large stone. It's what's called an orthostat stone. And around that stone, located in multiple different contexts or units, were horns. Lots and lots of horns. This is Dr. Melissa Kennedy. She's the lead researcher on Mustatil, and here she is holding a cattle horn that is over 7,000 years old. Look at the preservation of these things. What you're seeing there is what's called a keratin horn sheath. Keratin is the stuff that your fingernails is made out of, and it's often something that just disintegrates very quickly after the death of an individual or an animal. All of these remains were processed by an archaeozoologist, a person who studies ancient animal bones, or faunal remains as we call them. Her name is Dr. Laura Strolin, and Laura was able to recognize that we have primarily cattle remains in the Mustatil, a couple of goat, and a gazelle. You might be asking yourself, why cattle and goats? And well, It ends up that these are the earliest domesticated animals present in this part of Arabia, which is really cool. So these were the new animals on the block, and people were really excited about having them. So as we excavated down into the chamber, we found horn after horn, we found lots and lots of cattle teeth, and we found fragments of skulls. But what's fascinating about this is that all of the bones that were identified in this Mustatil are only what are called upper cranial elements, effectively from this part of the skull up. Not one single other bone was found of any other part of the body. We don't find any mandibles, the lower jaw, we don't find any vertebrae, we don't find any ribs, legs, anything. Just upper cranial elements. Weird. But the excitement wasn't just in the chamber itself. We placed a thing called a test trench inside the courtyard in the corner next to the head, and there we found pebbles. Now, that might sound a bit boring, but these pebbles were laid flat on the ground. 7,000 years ago, someone had laid down pebbles and paved an area of this Mustatil. Cool. Obviously, we had the question about whether the faunal remains that we were finding, these upper cranial elements, skulls, teeth, horns, do we just have a weird Mustatil? Is something funky happening here? Or is this common practice? So the only way to work that out is by excavating more. And what we found is that every time we excavated a Mustatil, no matter which Mustatil it is, no matter what shape it is, we found only upper cranial elements of animals. Except in one or two instances where people have come back, hundreds or thousands of years later and placed animal remains in or around this structure. But in terms of the use of these structures, what was being placed inside of these chambers, it was only ever upper cranial elements. That's it. One of the questions you might have is, well, does that part of the body preserve better than others? No. Well, you can imagine that if you had a full bull and you sacrificed it and you cut its head off, right? Things like its femur or its pelvis are really big, chunky bones. Those are going to survive. But we're finding even really fragile parts of the skull indicating that, preservation is good. We've even found things like coprolites. This is ancient dung, over 7,000 years old, of what we believe to be a hyena. We have found some other things in Mustatil. In this one, which I excavated a few years ago, we found the remains of a ceramic pot. It's not much to look at, but as far as we can tell so far, this is the earliest ceramic vessel that has currently been found in this part of Arabia. We've also found arrowheads in one of them, and we're not quite sure why that specific Mustatil has some arrowheads in it, but gosh, aren't they pretty? You might remember that we found some gazelle horns, for example. So hunting was something that was still happening in the region, and so maybe these arrowheads were representative of that. So how do we know these structures are so old? Well, because we're finding faunal remains and we're also finding bits of charcoal, we can radiocarbon or C14 date those. And that allows us to understand exactly how old some of these Mustatil are. We find that there's a range of dates from about 5300 BCE down to about 4500 BCE, give or take a couple of centuries or so. So let's put all the pieces together. We have monumental structures, some of which are 500 or 600 meters in length. They have these really bizarre little entranceways where you kind of have to squeeze through in order to get into the courtyard. You go to the head of the Mustatil, and inside you only find upper cranial elements of horned animals. You find the odd artifact, but not much. What are these things for? We think these are ritual structures, and I know what you're saying, which is when an archaeologist doesn't know what something is for, we call it ritual. But the reality is that we know what other types of structures are based off what we find in them. As I demonstrated in my last video, we know what tombs are in this region. We have Neolithic tombs. In fact, we've found 4 examples of Neolithic collective tombs filled with multiple individuals. We know what domestic structures were like at this time because we excavate those too. Jane McMahon, who is the assistant director of our project, leads the research into these structures, which are called standing stone circles. These are domestic structures. I'm going to make a video about them in the future, so I'm not going to go into too much depth. Inside these structures, we find what are called typical domestic assemblages. Lots of fragments of chip stone where people are making stone artifacts. Masses of broken up little bits of bone from people's food. And yes, these bone fragments are from all parts of the animal, not just upper cranial elements. We find things like jewelry or various other bits and pieces that people were making in their spare time or maybe on a rainy day. We know what a domestic structure looks like, and that is not a Mustatil. So if these are ritual structures, why were they built? And our theory has always been that Mustatil are associated with water. Cattle need a lot of water, and so we think that there is obviously some association between the Mustatil and water. We regularly find Mustatil located near major water sources. That could be lake beds, such as this amazing site which has multiple Mustatil located over a very large lake bed, which only fills up seasonally. We also find them located near the bends of wadi systems or rivers. This is the location on these wadis of major pools where the water settles and holds for a long time, even when the wadi itself isn't flowing. And recently, Amy Hatton from Max Planck University and her colleagues did a GIS analysis of Mustatil in one region and found that statistically, a lot of them have a close relationship with water. So it kind of helped prove our initial theory. But there's something else that's a bit strange about Mustatil. The very first one that we excavated, we found a structure located just off to the side of the head of the Mustatil, actually basically just touching it, almost cutting the edge of the Mustatil itself. When we excavated this structure, we found something which we were not expecting. We found bits of human skeletons. Some vertebrae, a few long bones, and half a foot. The bit of the foot that we found seemed to still be articulated, the bones themselves hadn't been sort of moved around as such, which leads us to think that there was actually soft tissue present on those bones when the foot was laid down. But interestingly, it wasn't just this Mustatil that we found fragments of human remains. In several other Mustatils, we also found fragmentary human remains. In fact, only in one have we found a complete skeleton, that of a 9 to 12-year-old child. All of these human remains date to several hundred years after the last sort of official use of the Mustatil for depositing ritual remains of animals. It seems to have been some kind of unusual second phase where people were placing fragmentary pieces of human remains in the Mustatil. We think perhaps to try and associate themselves with these structures. You can imagine walking across the landscape, coming across these monstrous, massive structures, and using them as stories about your ancestors and wanting to associate yourself and your family with them. So you go and take a few fragments of your recently deceased grandfather or something, and you place them in there. And it means that whenever you walk past it, you can say, hey, that's where my family member is. That's a theory that we have so far, at least. But archaeology isn't just digging. One of the other things we're doing is throwing an absolute ton of science at these things. Because these are very early domesticated animals for this part of the world, we want to DNA test them in order to understand where these animals were introduced from. And because we're finding the upper cranial elements of animals, we're really lucky that those are actually some of the best parts that preserve DNA. There's a part of skulls called the petrous bone. It's located just back here. It's a big, dense part of your skull, and it is actually one of the best preservers of DNA in the entire human body. Now, I'm very happy to say that we actually got a hit for one of our cattle petrous bones, and analysis is ongoing. Basically, who were the great-great-great-grandparents of our Mustatil cattle? As I mentioned before, one of the things we regularly find as part of these upper cranial elements is cattle teeth. We find little flakes of them, but we also find big, full cattle teeth. And we're doing a lot of analysis on those. The first thing that we did was we took casts of cattle teeth, and that will allow us to send those casts off to specialists who can look at the subtle marks on the teeth and determine things like what kind of foliage cattle were eating. Also, we are doing a thing called isotope analysis. Our amazing archaeozoologist Laura was able to identify a lot of specific types of molars called the M3. The M3 grow in an animal's mouth from around, say, 9 to 10 months old up to about 24 months old. So they grow over a period of about 12 to 14 months. Now, our colleague, Dr. Rudy Allegich, is able to take small samples every 1 millimeter up the tooth. This powder can be sent off for isotope analysis. In this case, we're doing oxygen-18 and carbon-13. These kinds of isotopes can do amazing things. For example, we can use them to look at what animals were eating and drinking, and use these isotopes to reconstruct what the environment looked like. Because the way the M3 molar grows, and because Rudy took a sample every millimeter, every sample equates to effectively a few weeks or months of that cattle's life. So, in less archaeology nerd talk, these teeth are acting as our ancient weather records, revealing the climate 7,000 years ago. We can also do this thing called paleoproteomics, which to me is just super cool. Basically, it uses this thing called the melanogen proteins in tooth enamel to determine sex. Yep, that's right. Tooth enamel is slightly different depending on if you're born male or female, and this technique can be used on both humans and cattle. We're hoping to publish all of this soon. Now, one thing we have done is use what's called ethnographic studies to help us understand how long it might have taken to build one of these Mustatil. Ethnography is where you scientifically record modern customs and habits and so forth. Now, 2 studies have been made on Mayan stone moving. Abrams, who did these experiments, suggested that one person could move around 7,200 kilograms of stone in a typical 8-hour day. An earlier study by Erasmus suggested that moving stones about 50 meters, a single person could move around 4,000 kilograms in a 5-hour day. Now, we know that the stone that they're using for our Mustatil was just picked up off the ground around them. They didn't quarry it or anything like that, so these studies are probably pretty relevant. Some of the Mustatil are massive. This example here is 525 meters long. Now, when we surveyed it, we took a bunch of detailed measurements of things like the width and the height and the length of walls, and we were able to also kind of note down how much empty space was present in those walls. And what we were able to work out is that the Mustatil is comprised of 12,000 tons of stone. To give you an idea, that's about 20 A380 planes. So our big 12,000 ton Mustatil, how long would it take to make? Well, depending on which of these studies you believe, if you had 50 people, it would be somewhere between 33 and 60 days. But remember, this is just the people moving these stones. There would have also been people looking after the herds of animals, children, the elderly, cooking, hunting, all of that stuff. So it means that there were hundreds of people in the area. So we think this indicates that this isn't one family group. It's probably communities coming together to make these. Want to hear a fun fact? Well, obviously we know these cattle are being sacrificed. We find cut marks on the bones, for example, and that leads us to think that they were probably eating them. Makes sense, right? You have a nice big barbecue. Now, ethnography tells us how many people could eat one animal. A single sub-adult bull, say, could produce about 100 to 120 kilograms of meat and maybe 7 liters of blood. And yet, I know what you're thinking. Blood? What? But, you know, people drink blood today, and there's blood sausage and various other bits and pieces. So blood is a really important thing that you can get from cattle. So in this example, with one sub-adult male, you could tuck into a tasty 200-gram steak with 600 of your mates. Or you could have less people eat more, or for longer, you know, over a couple of days. Imagine you were sacrificing 3 or 4 or even more bulls. This would have been a huge amount of food. Mustatil are phenomenal. They are changing what we think about the Neolithic period. So why is this so revolutionary? Well, the fact that so many of these structures were built in the same way, with the same ritual offerings of these upper cranial elements, suggests that much of Saudi at this time had similar ritual beliefs, similar language, but spread over an absolutely massive area, 350,000 square kilometers, and that's just what we know about at the moment. This isn't some small group of people, it's a massive cultural phenomenon. In my mind, it completely changes how we view Neolithic communities. Less than 20 Mustatil have been excavated of the 1,600 plus that have been identified across Saudi Arabia. And other teams are currently excavating Mustatil around Saudi Arabia. They're going to find their own results. Some of it will match what we have, some of it might be different, but it means that this is an evolving theory about these structures. It's so exciting as an archaeologist to be part of this first wave of information that's coming through. If you're interested in Mustatil, in the description below, I'm going to post links to open access papers, that is free papers that you can read on Mustatil, produced by our team. I'm going to share our colleagues' research in Mustatil as well, so you can see what other teams are doing. And I'll also share the Discovery Channel documentary that charts the excavation of the very first Mustatil and has this very unfortunate image of me in it. I really hope you've enjoyed me digging deeper into Mustatil. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers.